Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight's program, which will be recorded. My name is Renee Maurer, and I'm the Associate Curator at the Phillips Collection. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight's featured speaker, Dr. Adrienne Childs. She's the guest curator of our exhibition, Riffs and Relations, African American Artists and the European Modernist Tradition. Dr. Childs is an art historian, curator, and an associate of the W.E. Du Bois Research Institute at the Hutchinson Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. She has held fellowships at the Center for the Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art, the Clark Art Institute, and many other institutions. She is co-editor of the book, Blacks in European Art of the Long 19th Century. She has also served as curator at the David C. Driscoll Center at the University of Maryland. It's been a great pleasure to work with Adrienne on this project, which she brought to us as a proposal for both a book and an exhibition to our director in 2017. And with the help of an advisory committee, the checklist developed, loans were secured, and texts were written. Riffs and Relations presents works by African American artists of the 20th and 21st centuries, with examples by early 20th century European modernists with whom they engaged. It assembles 72 works by 53 artists grouped into loose themes that explore complex intergenerational connections around modernism. And the Phillips was very eager to host this exhibition because it aligned so well with our interest in bringing together works from various moments to show enduring relationships. Now, our visitors were only able to see Riffs for 2 weeks. So we are now developing virtual programs like this one, and we have been able to extend the show through January 3rd of 2021 so that more people can enjoy it when we do reopen. So I want to thank our many lenders and our supporters, the Frauke and Willem de Luperl Charitable Fund, Altria Group, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond J. Horowitz Foundation for the Arts, the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, the Robert Lehman Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, Eric Richter, Amanda and Earl W. Stafford, George Vredenberg, and the Vredenberg Foundation. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Adrienne. Please save your questions until after the presentation. Either raise your hand or use the chat feature, and we will all be in gallery view. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome to everybody. Thank you all for tuning in to this this virtual tour. It's very unusual for me to do this. Well, now it's perfectly normal now, but it's not the way we would have wanted to have engaged with you. But I'm so glad that we have so many people here to come and hear me talk about Riffs and Relations, which is a project really close to my heart. I've been working on it for a long time. I was just working on the ideas for a long time, mulling it over with colleagues. I did a journal, a guest edited journal along with Jackie Francis, another scholar, about these ideas of riffing, Black artists riffing on the European canon. And then brought it to the Phillips Collection with the, just as a discussion, and it ended up really working out well. I was so pleased to be working with Renee Maurer and all the rest of the team, the fantastic team, and even the installation team was fantastic to come to put something beautiful together. And so I'm happy to show you the wonderful photos that, thank God, they took of the exhibition that will give us a really great idea of being in the space and thinking about how this unusual grouping of artists can give us some insights into American art of the 20th century. So something is happening. Okay, it doesn't want to advance by this. I'll have to do that. Riffs and Relations, African American Artists and the European Modernist Tradition. So pretend you're walking up the stairs at the Phillips Collection and you come into our first room where we introduce you to the concept of the exhibition and not surprise you, but wow you over with some very big, powerful works of art that challenge us to think about what it meant for African American artists to engage with and think about, react to the very powerful forces of modernism that drove 20th century art and continue to intrigue and challenge artists up to this very day. So riffs, what does it mean to riff on something? I mean, it's a musical term, as we all know. It's a jazz term. You take something, you make it, you switch it up a little bit, you make it your own. But it's used widely, especially when it comes to thinking about visual arts and visual languages, and taking on an artist or past artist usually, but not always, assuming or appropriating a work that's recognizable by them. Most of the time the works are recognizable, and then turning it into your own for the sake of many, for many reasons. You could be critiquing, you could be paying homage, you could be humorous, ironic, you could be critiquing the artist itself, you could be critiquing the history of art writ large. So there are many ways or reasons why artists riff on other artists. I was particularly, being someone who studies both European art and art by African Americans or African American art, I was always interested in how African American artists went back to the 19th century or went back to early 20th century or even before, and it kind of invaded the spaces of the hallowed spaces of the history of art. Because I'm a historian and my degree is in 19th century European art. So, and that's really fertile ground for a lot of American artists, period. A lot of artists really go back there and try to reconfigure that very important period. And so what is it about Black artists? What are the themes that Black artists seem to gravitate to? And what does that do coming from a marginalized status, right? In many cases. We know in America, race is one of the fault lines. There's no way there's no way around it. And so what do Black artists do when racial issues that may or may not be relevant to them or that may or may not be their agenda, what do Black artists do with that gulf, the racial gulf between them and quote unquote the quote unquote masters? What do they do when they want to discuss racial issues through recognizable works of art? So that's sort of the major overarching theme. And of course, we know that African American art is really, in terms of a critical mass, a 20th century phenomenon. So it grows up literally with modernism. It is a modernist project. So it's interesting to see where these relationships go over the course of the century and continue to, like I say, continue to show interest with contemporary artists. So I thought it would be fun to look at the relationship between, or reactions to Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. So that's what you see is the kind of a deep dive into several Black artists who have considered this and what have they done with it. On the right, you're looking at the very large piece by Rob Colescott, who is well known for his humorous, critical, body kinds of reactions to history of art. And here is his luncheon with Joaquim, a Sunday afternoon with Joaquim Murrieta, who is a California outlaw bandito from the 19th century. And it really brings to the fore a lot of racial issues in American racial politics, right? And sexual politics, which is really what we often see with Bob Colescott. But he does it with the composition of Manet's famous Luncheon on the Grass. And he is an artist that wants to tangle with Manet. He wants to dominate, or he wants to be in conversation with the quote unquote masters, because that's how he sees himself. I mean, these are his words throughout the years. So he very much approaches it from a kind of almost a competition when he tangles with Manet or Picasso. But on the other hand, artists like Renee Cox, who you see on the left with the photograph. Now Renee Cox is doing work in 2001, but in the late 90s, she did a whole series of work that really responds to European art. And this one she calls Cousins at Pussy Pond. And Pussy Pond is a real place in the Hamptons, and these are not her cousins, but the notion of the series is about the quote-unquote family. And in this piece, She is really inhabiting that space, and she is the artist, and this is a self-portrait, and she often puts herself in these portraits. And so she is one of her primary subjects throughout her body of work. So as the artist and the subject, she says she's raiding art history. She is entering it, and she's dominating, and she's also very sexually, she's aggressive, or I won't say explicit, but comfortable with her own sexuality. And this is a kind of, the kind of work that she does, like I said, kind of across the board. And she is, being both artist and subject, she's reframing how we might look at a Black female artist and asserting her own identity as a female artist. And she, and this is one of the things that we find throughout when some of the artists begin to challenge the history of art. And it's because they're interested in disturbing those hierarchies in which they are often marginalized, particularly African-American artists. And they're also entering into a dialogue that they were not always placed in, if you will. So this room continues, and we have several other artists who engage in this discussion with Manet about his very infamous luncheon on the grass. I want to go to the next, I'm sorry. And one of them is the artist Mickalene Thomas. And I think it was very important to have a work by Mickalene. And you're looking at a Manet's luncheon here next to Mickalene's. And we do not have Manet's luncheon in this show, just to be clear. But we want, it is one of those recognizable images, right? And it was, of course, if we can just peel back our history of art, it was a scandal. It was a riff on an earlier piece of artwork. And it was a provocative work. And this is what Renee Cox, that we just saw, was trying to do. She's invading a provocative work to create another kind of provocative work. And Mickalene Thomas here, and Mickalene's work is from 2010, still concerned with this history of art, right? And what does she do with it? She doesn't do what Colescott did, trying to think about American history and think about interracial sexuality, or what miscegenation is something that he did, he attended to a lot in his work. But she's looking at the strength of Black females, the sexuality of Black females, the power of Black females, and kind of in her own signature aesthetic that reaches back to the 70s with the hairstyles and the clothing, all the bright colors. And so she's layering it quite a bit with her concerns as an artist, but in a recognizable compositions that will frankly bring a certain kind of attention to her work. And this piece is one of her, like I said, most, I guess, celebrated or famous works. She did many, many versions, huge, small. This one is a small collage that's in her collection. And so we were very lucky to get that. And she cuts it up and reassembles it in a very sort of Cubist style. And all of this is very, she's very aware and attuned to what she's doing and how she is layering her responses to art history, but making it very current in terms of her aesthetic. This photograph is taken in the courtyard of the Museum of Modern Art, and you see Matisse's back in the background. And later in the tour, we'll see another work by an African-American artist that dealt directly with that piece of sculpture there in Matisse's back. Again, also in this first room, because again, these connections are obvious or upfront or in your face connections between Black artists and historical art, and it gives you an idea of what we're doing. We have Titus Kafar, who's a contemporary artist who just won a MacArthur last year or the year before, for his work, his work that mines art history. And this piece is called Pushing Back the Light. And you see a woman in a parasol, and it's based on a Monet painting from the latter part of the 19th century. And she's she is, he really quotes the painting with a lot of fidelity, but of course, he erupts, he shows tar, and it's very textured tar erupting from the background. And you know, Monet's paintings are about many things. They're about contemporary life, daily life, his family, beauty, but they're also about light, right? And so he's pushing back the light, and it literally erupts underneath the canvas, which is crumpled up around the edges. And he wants us to think about what's happening around the world, right? At this time, in the scramble for Africa is going to come in a few years, but there is a lot of colonial pursuits going on, and with European powers. There is, we're talking about the aftermath of the Civil War in the United States. And we are also learning much more about the Black presence in Paris, in France, through the work of oh my goodness, well, the exhibition Posing Modernity, Denise Murrell's exhibition that got a lot of play, which talked about Black models and these impressionist artists and the Black people that were involved in their artistry and that they intersected with. So when we think about why it would be important to think about Blackness in the middle of the 19th century, there's more than meets the eye. And it's not something that the Impressionists were necessarily concerned with, but Kafar is saying, let's think about the bigger picture. Let's think about what else is going on in a global sense. And we were very lucky to get the actual work that Kafar is riffing on across the gallery there from the National Gallery of Art, Monet's Woman with the Parasol, and it's a beautiful painting and it's a well-known painting, and so it's interesting to see. Think about what he's doing. Doesn't have really designs on destroying the original, if you will, or Monet. He's really looking at challenging the artists to think about other things. I think this is what most of these artists are doing, to not destroy the source, but to decenter them. And this is one of the things that this exhibition is looking at. We certainly need and want the European art to be in the room with the African-American artists. That was one of the things I was very adamant about when I was thinking about doing an exhibition, hoping to do an exhibition like this. It was very important for us to be able to have Monet in the room with Kafar. It's very important for us to have Matisse, who's a large seated Nuger sitting here in the middle, in the room with Emma Amos, whose wall hanging on fabric you're seeing in the far left corner. And Monet is, Amos is quoting this wonderful sculpture by Matisse in the center of the room. And so it's important to us to be able to look at the dynamics of these relationships, but every piece in the show doesn't have a correlation. But we were very lucky to be able to have these relationships visible and established, and also to be able and to have the works stand with each other in ways that affirm all of the artists, because there is a sense. I mean, we've seen many works of art throughout the years that refer to other arts, but it's not all the time that we can see them all in the room together. And particularly when we talk about institutions that are maybe encyclopedic institutions that are mainstream, you don't often see them putting together. I mean, you used to not often see them putting together works by African-American artists and European artists. Now that's changing, European or white American artists. All that is changing now. But I thought it would be really interesting to be really targeted and selective about works and artists who are very specifically referring to other works of art. And one of the things that was really interesting about, and not just interesting, exciting about putting together a show like this, was to see relationships that developed that we were surprised about. And so we're looking at the Elizabeth Catlett sculpture in the far right corner, a reclining nude called Ife, Ife, and she is referring to the kingdom of Ife, the West African kingdom of Ife, the ancient kingdom. Classical art emerged from that society. But of course, Catlett is fusing together a hybrid of looking at African art, looking at European modernist art like Henry Moore, Jean Art. She's looking at also pre-Columbian art. And she is, but at the same time turning it into, or framing it into an African-American sort of cultural or an African cultural context. But how wonderful does it look with Matisse? Now, I never even thought of these together, but this is what we might look at as some of the relationships that are established in these, this, not necessarily a riff, but a relation. I remember early in this process, we were talking to some of the people at the museum and someone asked me, well, is that a riff or is it a relation? I said, oh my God, I don't even know. I mean, I get so, all of it is in my head such that I had to break down and think, okay, because this is a legitimate question. And there is there a difference? And sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. But I would say Catlett is definitely not riffing, but she is relating to modernism. I mean, and a reclining lute is a total modernist or a total European construct anyway. So we have to look at these artists as assuming and coming and pulling a lot together as they create their own singular visions. So that first room really was about responses to different modernist art and artists working, looking back. But this, and then we move into this really special area where we focus on artists who are really working in the moment and dealing with a very important part of modernist art, which is its debt to African art. And it has a very particular interest to African-American artists, right? Who, again, are coming together in critical ways early in the 20th century, trying to determine a new aesthetic that will, that we think of it as the Harlem Renaissance and New Negro movement, where artists and writers and thinkers are coming together to harness the power that they are gained, they're trying to gain in the 20th century, and harness art. And one of the powers is art that will establish identities, humanities that are driven by their own voices, their own concerns, and not under sort of the thumb of, racist American societies. But part of this is some of these artists did look to European artists for inspiration early in the 20th century. I mean, that's just all there was to it. And you're looking at three who did there on at the wall. In the center, in the back wall, is Hale Woodruff, whose card players, 1930 painted while he was in Paris studying. Several artists had to go to Europe to study for opportunities that were not readily available in the United States. On the right, to his right, is Lois Jones's Africa from the 1930s. And I'm going to say 1935, but I might be wrong. And it's very stylized, almost like a design or Art Deco-ish, a very unusual piece. And on the left is Aaron Douglas, a piece by Aaron Douglas that relates to his very well-known mural for the Schomburg Library in New York. But he did this 20 years later as a commission, but it still looks back to sort of the Negro in an African setting. So looking back to, these are 1920s and 30s. And what are these African-American artists doing? It's a lot of it is kind of a fantasy. It's coming through an interest in Art Deco. It's coming through an interest in defining themselves through an African past, or even a possible African future. I look at those Lois Jones's work there, and it looks like Afrofuturist. It looks like some of the costumes in the Black Panther movie, with her designs, her unusually designed earrings, and there's the tiger tooth necklace, etc. And the women have leaves for eyes. So these are graphic, and that piece was on the cover of Opportunity at one point, because she was a graphic designer. And she revisited the piece a few years later, and this is the painting that resulted from that. And this is before she goes to Paris and before she does her famous work called Les Fétiches. So this is really thinking about, well, what does Africa mean to me, that famous line, what does Africa mean to me, and trying to come to terms with that. And also for Hale Woodruff in the center, he's looking at Cézanne. He's looking at Picasso. He's looking at developing his own language of form through the avant-garde practices that he's seeing right in the 1930s in Paris. He sees there's a big Cézanne retrospective where he has his card players. So there's a lot of energy around working through modernism and African art, and it comes to, but it's a little fraught. And one of the things about modernist primitivism, which is what we call a lot of the European artists who deal with this material, we often don't think about how all of these objects get into Europe in the first place. And it's a sort of an offshoot, and I'll just go into my teacher mode for 1 minute, of the colonial project. And so there's an interesting map here that carves up Africa, and you see British and French West Africa and Belgium, and so these territories, I mean, it's not as simple as this, but this is the notion of the 1884 Berlin Conference, after this, that these countries are going to be ruling here, right? And through this system, one of the byproducts is that African objects start filtering into Berlin, they start filtering into Paris, they're in curio shops, they're in the ethnographic museums, and then at some point they start becoming considered as art. But there is blood on these objects. Not all of them were stolen, but many were, but their uneven power relations are embedded in their presence there. But when artists, these avant-garde artists, get a hold of them, they start seeing certain kinds of freedoms in them. They start seeing certain kind of formal excitement there. And it just takes off in so many different directions. I'm sure that it's an interesting phenomenon. And it ends up filtering to the United States. And so you see here, I have some of the European artists that we have in this gallery. We have Carl Schmidt-Rottluff on the left, and then Winold Reiss, who's a German artist, on the right. And of course, Reiss comes to the United States and ends up being Aaron Douglas's teacher. And he also works with Elaine Locke on the New Negro anthology. And so that is this illustration on the top upper left that we have in the show, African Fantasy, is actually illustrated, an illustration for the original New Negro. So you're thinking about Africa as a total fantasy here. It's very inflected with Egyptian type motifs. He does use what some might want to call kind of racist tropes, with big lips and noses, etc., but is very much of its time. So this designer does, in fact, heavily influence Aaron Douglas, who makes it his own and becomes sort of the visual voice of the Harlem Renaissance. But we also have Carl Schmidt-Rottluff on the right, three at a table. I brought this in because I thought it was great to show the women at a table when we had in the room with the Hale Woodruff, the card players are also at one of these tables. But also to think about how this engagement with African art, and you see it in the faces, the carved faces of the women at the table, are ways for him to create new identities for German people. I mean, they're going through these quote unquote primitive styles to think about new ways of representing themselves, right? And so artists like on the left, down on the bottom, James Wells, African-American artist, is doing the same, thinking about how to represent ourselves and our histories through these new languages. And he does take cues from German expressionist printmaking, and this is his quote unquote primitive girl. And she's certainly more dignified than some of these other notions of the primitive. So there are a lot of ways that African Americans have engaged with African art. And I'm going too slow as usual, but I do want to just say something about the quilt on the left-hand side, another fabric piece. We have 4 fabric pieces in the show by Sanford Biggers, Neger Plastique, and it refers to the book by Carl Einstein, 1915 it was published, that treated African objects as art or aesthetic objects, because it was a compendium of a lot of photographs of African art objects. So they start changing from the curio shop to sort of aesthetics, and it really impacted artists who were able to get their hands on it and really think about objects in a new way, think about form, etc. And so he's thinking about that and thinking about appropriation, and he's got this generic power figure there and the flowers and a tar, another artist using tar, shadow of the power figure. And you can't help but think about the notion of the word Neger Plastique. It means African sculpture or Black sculpture, but it also has a double entendre in English. So, and of course, none of these things are going to be lost on Sanford Biggers. But he's also looking back to this time of white European artists appropriating African art, and then kind of recasting that in his own work. And later on in the show, and I don't know if we'll even get there, we have a group of photographs by Frank Stewart. And I thought it was a nice opportunity to just think about our dear David Driscoll and this photograph of him in his home. And just thinking about how this issues of modernism and African art sustained many artists through the 20th century. And him in particular, he's sitting in there in his home, and he's got an Ifa divination tray behind his head. He's got Dan masks up on the wall. He's also got his portrait, his collage called Homage to Romare there on the wall. So he's always thinking about many multi-layered engagements with African art, African American art, European art, and behind him is a painting by Rouault, which I'm pronouncing incorrectly. So Driscoll is always moving in and out of these different influences and very much aware of this kind of synthesis. And of course, he will be missed. We're on into the next room, where I'm looking at the mid-century, right? And looking at sort of the aftermath of Cubism. And we have David Driscoll's Still Life with Sunset in the middle on the left, the red piece, next to a work by Wilfredo Lam. And Wilfredo Lam is an Afro-Cuban artist, of course, and he spent a lot of time in Spain, a lot of time in France. He was in the circle of Picasso and in the circle of the surrealist and other surrealist artists. And he kind of becomes a sort of a surrealist artist himself. And so somewhere along the line, I was asked by someone, are there any Black artists in Europe, European Black artists, who could be part of this? And I just couldn't think of any. And I feel terrible. But Wilfredo Lam comes to mind. He's not European. He goes back to Cuba after a while, and he develops his singular language that is very Cubist, very surrealist, and is concerned with Afro-Cuban issue or his own issues or own concerns. But it is really inflected by his experiences there, and he was there for such a long time that he's the one person that we can look at as having, maybe filling that space. I'm not sure. But another aspect of this is what happens in the United States with artists who are looking at things like Picasso's Cubism, right? We have on the back wall to the right, in the middle, next to the sculpture, Charles Alston, who is a very important teacher and through the Harlem Renaissance years and beyond in New York. But he's also clearly influenced by Picasso's Guernica here. And Guernica traveled the world, traveled the country. And when it came to Museum of Modern Art, they sent it out on tour. You know, it had to come over here to get preserved for the wars in Europe. But what I was trying to show by this is that a lot of times we could actually trace where the artists encountered the work, right? Because of, and a lot of times it's because of big institutions like MoMA. It's also because of institutions like the Phillips Collection. David Driscoll spoke a lot to us about how coming to the Phillips in the 60s, I'm going to say not the 50s, the 60s, was a welcoming place in DC. Not all the museums were welcoming, and it was somewhere he would come to look at the Braques, the Georges Braques, and the Juan Gris paintings, and everything else. And he frequented the Phillips, and so this is, and then as he continued on in his career, he was part of the relationships that they had, Duncan Phillips had with things like the Howard University Art Gallery. And there's a whole network of diverse artists and gallerists in DC who are exchanging ideas during this time. And David Driscoll was very much part of that. So kind of get that stuff gets lost in when the Black Power movement comes along. It just takes up so much space that we're now going back and thinking about what these relationships were nurtured back in those days. So institutions are very important. MoMA is very important. It seems like every time you turn around, there's a big Matisse show, and then everyone goes after him, or then we see all these responses. Another good thing about doing a show like this is you can bring in the people who are not the usual suspects. Like Harold Cousins, the sculpture on the right is Matador by Harold Cousins, and it's a Cubist sculpture. He was very much influenced by Julio Gonzalez, the Cubist sculptor in School of Paris sculptor. Harold Cousins goes there to Paris for a little while, ends up spending the rest of his life in Europe. And he's not somebody we know a lot about, but he is from DC, and I'll bet you anything he probably came to the Phillips back in the day. But we wanted to be able to show the different kinds of relationships. And artists who we don't always talk about in terms of African-American artists. Like, of course, we talk about on the left, we have Jacob Lawrence, but on the right, we have a Cubist sculptor named Osip Zadkine, who was both influential to Harold Cousins, who we just looked at, because he studied with him in Paris, but he was also a teacher to Elizabeth Catlett. And I really had wanted to have those two pieces in the room. We could not do it, put them together, but I still think this really is, it works because Zadkine was a very important teacher in many of those schools where they would take on, in his studio and in other schools in Paris early in the 20th century, where Black artists could come and take classes. And this is something that gets borne out in a lot of different work throughout the show, the fact that they had to travel somewhere else to get instruction and to kind of feel free of some of the racial bonds that might inhibit them or whatever. And but most of the artists come back to the United States and continue to use what they've learned to highlight, to deal with African-American themes, if that's what they're interested in, or abstraction or whatever. It's just like any other learning process. So these are some of our Picassos and Braques here that help in that room that we can play off of all the rest of the work. But I want to move on because I'm supposed to stop at 6:20. Is that right, Renee? Nod your head. Oh boy. Well, I'm going to then skip this, which is lovely.
Adrienne, if you want to go a little bit longer, you can.
Okay. All right. Oh boy. Okay. One of the things about this that's really interesting is to get a sense of place. For artists who go and stand in the same spots as other artists and really try to absorb points of view. And really interesting case is the case of William H. Johnson, who was a modernist artist, just like many of these artists are actually, we call them modernists. The exhibitions about them are called modernists. Anyway, William H. Johnson goes to Europe and stays for many years, or several years, and at one point he gets really jazzed by the School of Paris artist Chaim Soutine, and goes and follows in his footsteps. After a Soutine exhibition in Paris, goes down to the south of France, to Cagnes-sur-Mer, to paint the same sort of sun-drenched landscapes that Soutine focused on in that kaleidoscopic style. So we were very lucky to be able to have a Soutine and a Johnson there. And one of my little beefs is that when we talk about the School of Paris artists, many of these artists come from places, Russia, Lithuania, Italy, to study, and that's why we call it the School of Paris, right? It's kind of a general context of artists from around different spots coming to Paris and learning. Many of them knew each other, etc. But the Black artists who did the same thing really don't ever get labeled as that. What is that? And then on the other hand, we have Lois Jones, who does travel back and forth to Paris quite a bit, and a work that is in the collection of the Phillips Collection, in Place du Théâtre in Montmartre, and then the same spot or a similar spot. That's also the same name of the work has the same name, Place du Théâtre by Maurice Utrillo. So we're trying to just give people a sense that landscape, a sense of place, is also part of these, I guess, what I would call relations, not necessarily riffs. And of course, the Phillips Collection's wonderful Van Gogh is seen there, who was influential to William H. Johnson, but as we turn the corner, also very influential in the work of Beaufort Delaney. So we're skipping forward in the century to another expatriate artist, Beaufort Delaney, who comes out of the kind of Beat generation New York and ends up staying in Paris for basically most of his career, and he's is influenced heavily by Monet's Water Lilies, his late work that was reinstalled in L'Orangerie. And it caused him to think about dematerializing his forms, and so we see it there. And Monet, of course, was revered in France to a certain extent, well, very much so. And we see next to that the Haystacks by Henry O. Tanner, who was basically the most noted Black American expatriate artist of the early 20th century, and in Paris. And he becomes a French painter, becomes a Legion of Honor a recipient, etc. And his work is really decidedly impressionist. And after Monet dies, a year or two later, we see him doing these haystacks that I am interpreting as an homage. I don't really, so that's my interpretation. And then, of course, another work by Titus Kafar, where the tar disrupts the bucolic landscape. So he's making us think a little bit more about what is going on behind the scenes here. Not just beautiful picture, but think about what else is happening in terms of race. But the next room is where we see a lot of work that features female bodies. So we've taken several different themes. We looked at African art. We looked at kind of those riffing on the canonical works in the beginning, looking at African art and modernism, looking at Cubism, looking at landscape. And then now we're going to look at how the female body has been a lightning rod for so many European and American artists and African American artists, and then particularly how Matisse and Picasso seem to be, very influential in many different ways, very controversial when it comes to thinking about how modernist art has inflected the later 20th century, particularly feminist work. And so I just think it's so funny. I had to put these up a little bit more closer. We have Ellen Gallagher on the upper right, her gelatin silver print, where this is actually a photograph that was taken in Matisse's studio with he and his model. That Gallagher says her word is conscripts. She conscripts the photograph, puts her own face on the model and Freud's face onto Matisse's head. And she's looking at him, cutting those eyes like, are you kidding me? So she did this for the Freud Museum in London, and it takes on this whole ideas of the artist and the model in the studio, and the sexual dynamics, and also taking on the sort of notion of Freud being able to taking on the notion of the man who knows everything about the woman and resisting all these sort of male dominant narratives. But it also, just like so many people who take Matisse on, you do feel she's interested in his beauty, though, the beauty that his work, decorative beauty that his work always presents. So you see gold leaf with the acanthus leaves and other little florals around that she has on this photograph. And this photograph is in several different incarnations. It's a big projection, and we just have the small kind of original photograph where she gets us to start thinking about what must it have been like in the studio. What must these models have gone through, or what must a female artist, how does a female artist fight back or intervene into that relationship? And on the left, we have the Phillips Collection's Matisse's studio, Quai Saint-Michel, where we see the chair on the left and the woman reclining, and it's interesting that it's the same kind of composition or same setup as we have later on with the photograph of he in his studio where he sits there. So I'm assuming that chair is, I think the museum also assumes that the chair is Matisse, and he's close to the model. And so it's interesting how this, he has the same working process. And then of course, Picasso's reclining nude down at the bottom. I just do have to go, but so this room deals with images of women in the studio, and thinking about how the artist studio is a fraught space. We also have here the work by Jenna Taylor Pickett, who is a devotee, if you will, of Matisse. She is not trying to intervene into that model relationship or the exoticism of that, that he perpetuates, but she's interested in his work as a contemporary. She says she's a collaborator with him, and she has no problem with saying that a Black woman of color in the 21st century can engage directly and fruitfully with a quote unquote old master, which is something I don't like to say, artists, but most artists, Matisse is one of those artists who most artists like or have something that they can draw from him, because he's sort of an artist. Because I'm so late, I'm going to move on to just look at these two works briefly. They loom large in that room, and they are both about artist studios. They both engage the Demoiselle d'Avignon, Picasso, but in very, very different ways. On the left, you have Faith Ringgold's Picasso studio, where she is, her alter ego is lounging in Picasso's studio in front of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, but she's a Black woman, and she's throwing into relief, I think, the debt that Picasso's work has to African art, and then by extension, African bodies. Now, the Demoiselles d'Avignon is not an image that's supposed to represent Black women, I don't think. I mean, most of us really don't believe that they are supposed to represent Black women, but Blackness figures into those African masks, and those African masks figure into his construct of the aggressive, the sexual, the degenerate. And that's where people start breaking down and thinking about how he and other artists use those. They were freeing to them, but at what cost? And what do you really know about them, and what does that say about those relationships? And then their legacy of colonialism that frames them. But on the other hand, Faith Ringgold, is very comfortable in this space because, well, the character is comfortable because she's also an artist and a model. Just like on the right, you have Makita Ahuja, who created this work specifically for the show. She created a series of work specifically for the show. So did Jan Taylor Pickett. And we were able to decide and choose one. She really wanted to. I was going to choose another work, but she wanted to try to present something else, and then we could choose it. So we did like it. And here she is, pregnant. We're lounging there, holding up her sonogram. She had a lot of trouble with pregnancies. And so she's representing herself as a self-portrait in a sort of the positive light, but in front of a picture that is a riff, if you will, on Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. So it's a picture within a picture. The painting behind is actually another painting of hers that is dealing with sort of the aggressive issues of sexuality and the potential for pain that might come from sexuality. In her case, there was a lot of pain in terms of her difficulties having children. And it deals with those aggressions, the aggressiveness of the women in Picasso's Demoiselles. So she's trying to unpack that. And many of these figures here are self-portraits of her. She even has her self-portrait in the back as Picasso's crying woman. But the good news is that when these exhibitions are not just happening in a vacuum, real people are associated with them. And at the opening, Makita came with her baby, and it all was well that ends well. So we were very happy to see them. But these are very deep concerns for artists who have most of these, especially these late 20th century artists, they've all been to art school, they've studied the history of art, and gone through all of this, and are trying to position themselves and think through these things that remain powerful forces. And how do their personal histories, how do they intersect with these powerful forces in the art world? And the last, I'm going to stop soon. The last room is our where we're dealing with a lot of abstraction. We have a wonderful work by Martin Puryear here in the foreground. Face down is called. It's a bronze, which is unusual for Puryear. He of course is one of America's foremost artists, foremost sculptors, and he works mostly in wood and natural fibers, natural things. But this bronze is, in my opinion and several others' opinions, a response to Brancusi. And Brancusi is fundamental and foundational to his work. I mean, there's just no question as a minimalist sculptor, but he always makes it his own, and he always, not just that, but he is one to not want to color your perception of the work by heavy interpretation, which is something that I, of course, want to do, but he doesn't want that. He wants you to have a relationship with the work itself. But we all see Brancusi there. But what I also see is the holes in the head of this figure, and it is a head. It has an ear there and a neck, and it reminds me of the holes that you might find in Benin bronzes. That African bronzes where there were a lot of holes where they would put objects through to emulate hair and things like that, and other decoration of the objects. And so I think he really is fusing that, and then there's subtle reference to Brancusi's debt to African art. I'm getting so toward the end, and I'll probably end up having to cut it short because we might have some questions, but we do deal with minimalism, abstraction, and Matisse's cutouts, which were very influential to Bearden on the left, to Alma Thomas in the center, and there's a Matisse on the right, and to Hank Willis Thomas, and what he's done here is another quilt. So this is like four fabric pieces in the exhibition, two by men, two by women, and Thomas is looking at Matisse's Icarus, and in terms of sports industrial complex, in terms of the global sports, how Black athletes globally are in this almost colonial, he thinks of it as somewhat of a colonial relationship, where they're used for these teams, especially particularly soccer teams. And we're thinking of how athletes, and many of these athletes fly high to the sun, fly too close to the sun perhaps, and then fall out down from the sky, thinking of, very literally thinking of Kobe Bryant, but this was done before that happened. But also about how they are employed in this very lucrative business, but often end up in very precarious situations. So it's an interesting play on Matisse's jazz series. And also when people come into the room, they wonder, well, is this a chalk outline of a dead body? I didn't even think of that, of course. And so there are many ways, it's oriented to the right as if it is laying down. So I wonder whether Thomas even thought of that. And when we talk about sort of Black Lives Matter issues in the United States. But it is also a really interesting way to think about sports. And he has a whole series based on Stewart Davis and Matisse that deals with sports. So these are many of the different ways that Black artists take on these canonical images and objects and turn them into works that explore themes of African American life, themes of their own concern, or just purely aesthetic interpretations. So with that, I'm going to let someone ask me if there are any questions. I hope you had put some questions in the chat. And should I, or you can raise your hand now. I'm going to stop sharing. Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead and stop sharing.
Okay, great.
And Adrienne, we did get one question through the chat. The question is, how are the artists and works received during this period in their engagement with African art as African Americans?
During this period, meaning during in the 20s and 30s?
I think so, yes. This was asked towards the beginning of your talk.
They were, I think, well, it's interesting. I think they were received well. They were considered forward-looking or avant-garde because this was still very new in general. Some thought that they should be more looking at more traditional ways of methods of artistry, kind of reproducing or dealing with kind of academic art, and others felt that claiming African art or using this kind of aesthetics was an assertion of identity that was very important and made them modern. I mean, there were a lot of exhibitions by the Harman Foundation that took African American art all over the country, and what it was a way of asserting a certain kind of not just identity, but sophistication to claim that Black people are artists, because that's a high level of thinking, that's a high level of operating, right? And so this was some way, it was almost like there was a social message to even being able to show that, yes, Black people are artists and not just minstrels and the way that they're being looked at from the society. So it was very important. But yes, they were received well, particularly with the more progressive bent, like Elaine Locke, who was very interested in them using that, because it was something that was quote unquote their own, even if they didn't understand it like they do now, right? It was all kind of new, but it was something that was unique to them, and it was not necessarily the providence of the traditional white American academic artists, even though they were engaging with it too, because once the European modernists started doing, everyone's following them. But African Americans had a heritage claim that they were that would make it a bit different for them.
If anybody else has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask that question of Adrienne.
Adrienne, thanks for the call. I'd just like to ask if there were any African-American artists that dealt with violence and anger, inner city activities that you came across or that are in this exhibit?
Well, you mean in the work or just in their lives?
In their works.
Ah, okay. Violence and anger. Yeah, I mean, certainly the more contemporary artists are dealing with that, and even some of the. Oh, let me think about that. Yes, I think that. Well, I know Willis Thomas deals with violence and anger in his works, particularly around the murder of his cousin, and there are like people like Lewis, Norman Lewis dealt with sort of riots and in an abstract way and procession and kind of street issues of violence in the streets and issues of civil rights were very much paramount to them. And you might not see it in somebody like Lewis's work, but it's there. Somebody like Woodruff, Hale Woodruff as well. They were Romare Bearden, certainly, and many of his collages dealt with the politics of the day and in issues of the day. And so you do have people that are dealing with what's happening on the ground in the real time.
I just raised it because you dealt with the Harlem independence and the independence from a racist American society. So that's what got me thinking. That was a very powerful statement, I thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And if I really thought about it, I could probably come up with more. But I think as time goes on, people are freer and freer to represent those themes in art, particularly when you get into the Black Power movement and beyond. And then Rob Colescott just deals with everything. I think I saw somebody typing, or did I, or any other questions? Oh, there's Nolan. Hi.
Adrienne, hi.
Oh, I'm so glad to see you. I'm usually looking at you.
Thank you, and thank Del Mott for sharing the invitation, and thank you, Phillips, for having this. What an amazing exhibition. Congratulations to you. Really enjoyed the exhibition and your curation of it. It's clear the passion that you have, so congratulations.
Thank you.
I had a thought. I wondered if you thought about the kind of reversal of this. I don't see a lot shared about the influence of African art on even the Europeans and some of the classical kind of pieces that have been created, particularly looking at someone like Picasso. And it's my understanding, at some point I saw that like he may have been influenced by African art, particularly mass, in the development of Cubism. Yes. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on going the opposite way, not looking at European forward, but looking at African backward.
Or African forward. Well, definitely they are influenced by African art. Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, correct.
The European artists are influenced by African art, and then they are doing a lot of different things with it, right? It's not their necessary patrimony, right? And so they're looking at it more formally, more the forms or almost and superstitions about what they think it might mean. And there was a whole lot of European artists looking at the primitive cultures, not just Africa, but Oceania, looking at, and even looking at Native American art and looking at children who were considered primitive, because they're shunning, these avant-garde artists are trying to get rid of the stale tradition of European art that was so overwrought and so wound up in hierarchies and wound up in realism and wound up in they had a stranglehold on society. So this art was like a social, looking at this art was a social statement as well, right? But that is the beef that a lot of the African-American artists, particularly later on, when you really have time to think about it, have with these artists early on, like Picasso. Matisse was very influenced and interested in it as well, Brancusi, because sometimes they get a little fast and loose with it, and it turns out to be racist. But at other time, but again, it's all a process. You can't say, it's so hard to pinpoint it at one thing, right? But it was extremely important, and there's been a lot of really great work done on that. My colleague Wendy Grossman had an exhibition at the Phillips on the way African art influenced Man Ray and other surrealist photographers. So they almost look at it as something that is, I mean, it's very patronizing in some ways, but look at it as something almost like magic through which they can shed their the social strictures of post-Victorian Europe and come into something new and modern. So it's very important, and even more important than most people know, because you said you really hadn't even seen much discussion of it. But it infiltrates there, and that's again what a lot of people are thinking, especially Picasso. For some reason, he gets on people's nerves with all that, because later on in Picasso's life, he says, "Oh, African art? What? Not me." I mean, because he's been asked about it so much. He lived so long that he's already a quote unquote great artist, and people are asking him stuff all the time about it, because it's it's something that he gets tired of being asked about. And he just said, "What? I don't know."
Redaction is history.
Right. Because at the end, he wants that material to be his own, right?
Correct.
So it's just kind of funny. I guess he got sick of it. Yes, Teresa.
Adrienne, thank you so much for being there again. I remember you from the show on conversations in African American, in the African arts.
Oh, yes.
But that was such a wonderful show.
Oh, thank you.
I was thinking that maybe Jacob Lawrence would have come up in your presentation, and the Phillips Collection has a wonderful, wonderful section of Jacob Lawrence.
Oh, I know.
Does he come later? Is he not really from that period, or is there another reason?
He was there. I didn't land on him because I rattled on too much at the beginning, but he's there in our quote unquote Cubist gallery, or looking about how Cubism impacted these different artists. So I didn't want to necessarily use the series, the wonderful migration series, because it's been used so much. So we have a new piece by Lawrence that had not been shown at the Phillips. It's really gorgeous too. And it shows really, I mean, it's almost abstract in its sort of Cubist forms and flatness. And so I didn't land on it too long, sorry.
And that's in the show? That's in the show,
yeah. We did see it for a minute. But
thank you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Renee, did you want to say something?
The work is called Going Home. It's from 1946, and it's a promised gift to the museum. It's been on display on one other occasion when we did a Degata Dievenkorn exhibition where we were highlighting gifts in 2008. So it's only been the second time we've been able to highlight this work, and it's wonderful to have it. And as Adrienne said, it was about, thinking about the migration series, yes, which is up in another area of the museum, but also thinking beyond the migration series. And so Going Home was just the perfect example for that.
Thank you.
Hi, Adrienne.
Hi,
how are you? Great exhibit. Do I understand that it's going to be extended until January 3rd of 2021?
Yep, that is what yes, that's the plan.
That's the plan. So it's possible, given the situation we're in now, but perhaps by then we may be able to actually come to the Phillips to see it.
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay.
Oh, yes, that's the hope.
That's the hope. Okay. And who was the artist that was on the cover of the publicity material? The woman in the on the cover.
Yes, she is Janet Taylor Pickett, who did a piece based on the Phillips Collection's Matisse Egyptian with the interior with Egyptian curtain. She did that piece for the show. And then the Phillips has now acquired that piece in their collection. So it's a collage that by Janet Taylor Pickett. And I did talk about it for a minute because she's the artist who has a very positive relationship, let's say, with Matisse as an inspiration, but uses it to think about her concerns as a Black woman who is very family oriented, but looking at Black women's issues. And she's also interested in the decorative, interested in using the decorative in serious ways, and she's interested in beauty. And sometimes artists who say that some people think that they're not serious, but that beauty is a serious concern, just like anything else.
Hey, Adrienne, it's Dale.
Hi, Dale.
Are you all going to tour the exhibition? Is there another venue for the exhibition?
No.
Okay.
We can barely get people in.
No, I know. And I'm also thinking about some of the work that you have in the exhibition. It may not need to travel far from home. Pretty exceptional work. So
yeah,
there was another venue.
No, but we have the book, and the book is a collaboration with me, Renee, and Valerie Cassell-Oliver, and we won the Driscoll, the James A. Porter David Driscoll Book Award for African American art history. So we're very proud of that. This has been a collaborative effort. We've had many people who are helping us, who are advising us, like Ruth Fine, who brought us wonderful pieces by Frank Stewart, and I was only able to show one today, and it got cut off again at the end to show them. But we really, it takes a village, and the installation team, the registrar and the installation team were just stellar. So I'm really just thrilled with the whole thing, and I'm glad you guys have been able to see at least something of it and hear me rattle and prattle on. Anything else? Any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I just want to thank you so much for the thoughtful presentation of this work. I graduated with an art history degree and did a lot of my studies in 19th century painting, including French, and did my final paper on Winslow Homer's portrayal of African Americans, specifically the Gulf Stream. And when I walked in and saw the exhibit before the museum closed, I laughed out loud when I saw all of the presentations of Manet's work. And I loved the humor and the kind of meta statement that you were making. So I really appreciate it. It was really lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It makes me feel good, folks.
Hey, Renee. This is Neil Hartbarger. How you doing?
Hi.
I have, I guess, a high-level question.
Oh, no. Neil, you always do.
Yeah, I guess. Okay. I typed it into the chat window, so I'm going to read it back. Okay. Do you think Black artists are now having their moment, or is this a longer-term thing?
I think there's a moment. It doesn't mean it's not going to go on for a while or have some kind of sustained presence. But I think it's the moment, and then we know that because half the works we tried to borrow, we couldn't get because they're big exhibition by people like Colescott. There's big exhibition of Emma Amos. There's Bearden things are going, and museums don't want to get go of their Bearden piece because it's the favorite, and they're reinstalling the gallery, and I mean we could just go on forever. But what that did was make it more difficult to find work, but I think a better show because I wasn't getting the usual suspects lowest hanging fruit. But yes, I think Black artists are having a moment, and we'll see, and that's a good thing. But I also think that they're contemporary artists who are having that moment, and we wanted to shrink that in. So in the room with Biggers or Hank Willis Thomas, who's having his moment, we'll put people like Woodruff or or Alma Thomas. She's having a moment too. She's getting a new exhibition by her. But we're trying to bring together those whose shoulders are upon who these new young artists are standing, to see that this is nothing new. Hank riffing on the canon is nothing new, and that's one of the. And then Kehinde Wiley, right? He's not in the show because he didn't really fit in, but he's had his moment. But he is part of a big long continuum of this. Artists' variations on the masters that I thought was a good idea to start exploring how deep that really goes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate everything, and I appreciate everybody, and I'm happy to hear from you. And Renee, do you have any closing thoughts?
I just want to thank you for bringing us this wonderful exhibition.
Teresa?
Yes, there was a question about whether we will be able to buy the catalog.
Oh yeah, it's available. Well, Pete, do you want to say anything about that? Can they buy can the catalog be sold through the museum shop?
We don't have a commercial website. However, if you send an email to museumshop@phillipscollection.org, I'll try to arrange something to get it out to you. It may take a little bit of time, but rest assured, we'll try to get it out to you.
And do you know the price it will be sold at, the catalog?
Oh, it's right on our website as well. I'm sorry, I don't remember the price offhand, but it's right on our website. If you go to our main website, go to the shop tab. Consequently, there's a link to our email address, and just send the email address. The price will be on the website as well.
Okay, thank you.
One other thing, this is Nolan again.
I know.
I just posted in the chat a link to make a donation, because I just think those of us who are on here, if we were at the museum, we would contribute. So there's an opportunity to do that online.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
That's great.
And I just made a donation, so thank you all.
Thank you, Nolan.
I just pulled it up for everyone.
Nolan is a composer, and he's also done a brand new show, a musical called Grace.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it wasn't able to open when it was supposed to, but hopefully we'll be hearing more from him on that. And I can't wait to see it on Broadway.
I just pulled it up for everybody, and the catalog price is $50, not including shipping.
Okay.
However, if you're a member, mention the fact that you're a member of the Phillips, and you'll get your member discount.
So that Pete.
Thank you. Thank you, Renee.
Thank you, Adrienne. Stay tuned for more programs about Riffs. Check our social media pages and check our website. Thank you, and stay tuned.